All right, guys. Welcome. Yes, I'm wearing the same clothes as yesterday because you know what? I'm recording this on Tuesday. I am so excited because we have gotten to the point in our reading calendar where we get to start a unit on fairy tales. Now, yes, I am having you do activities involving rhyming for reading this week because that's our big language standard that we need to hit. So that's what I have you working on as far as work that needs to be turned in. Now, if you're tuning in and if you're watching this reading lesson, you're going to be ahead of the game because next week your things that you're going to need to turn in to me do involve fairy tales. So awesome job watching this video. Now, the fairy tale that we're going to focus on today is Cinderella. A lot of you may have seen the Disney version of Cinderella. The original fairy tale of Cinderella is a little bit more harsh. Do you remember when the ugly stepsisters, which isn't a very nice name, the ugly stepsisters tried to put Cinderella's glass slipper on and it didn't fit and it just popped off? Okay, in the original fairy tale, a little bit of a different situation happens. Now, parents, if you think that this is a little bit too violent, you can fast forward. I don't know exactly how long this summary of the original Cinderella is going to take, but when you see me hold up both books, then I'm moving on and explaining what we're doing next, so that's totally fine. So Cinderella was originally written by the Grimm brothers in 1812. Now, that doesn't mean that the story didn't exist before then. That just means these were the first people to write it down rather than to tell stories by mouth. We've talked about folk tales this year. Folk tales, just like fairy tales, started out by being spoken to, like bedtime stories, like campfire stories, before a writing system or a way to write things down came to be. So it begins, this fairy tale, with the death of a young girl's mother. She tells her daughter to be good and pray faithfully before she passes away. The next spring, her father remarries a very evil woman who has 2 daughters of her own. The 3 of them turn the young girl into a servant who must sleep on the floor in the cinders. That's why she gets the nickname Cinderella. Cinders are things that come out of like the fireplace that make you dirty. Despite being treated so poorly, Cinderella remains humble. Character trait. One day her father offers to bring something home from the fair for each of the girls. The stepsisters ask for beautiful dresses and fine jewels, but Cinderella simply asks her father to bring her the first branch that brushes against his hat. When he gives her this branch, she plants it by her mother's grave, and it grows into a beautiful tree. Any prayer made by Cinderella under this tree is granted to her by a little white bird who tosses down her wish from the branches. I wonder what the equivalent of that bird is in the Disney version. Now much time has passed, and Cinderella has endured her sufferings for many years. When the king announces that there is to be a 3-day festival for the prince to choose his bride, Cinderella wants desperately to attend. Her stepmother, however, makes it seemingly impossible by dumping lentils. If you are a herbivore, as you guys like to call me, a plant eater like me, you're familiar with lentils. They're teeny tiny little sources of protein. They're almost like small bean discs. I don't know how else to explain it to you if you aren't familiar with them. A very small bean-like food. Hey, not a bad description then. Into the ashes and forcing Cinderella to pick them all up. Oh, that would have taken forever. That would have been frustrating. Determined, Cinderella gets help from white doves, turtle doves, and all the birds in the sky. In no time at all, the lentils are picked up and put away. Next, Cinderella goes to the magic tree that has helped her often and tosses down a dress and slippers made of gold, silk, and silver. She is so beautiful at the ball that nobody recognizes her, and the prince falls madly in love. So at the end of the ball, which is a 3-day festival, she tries to sneak away each night. So it's not just one night. Each night she tries to sneak away before the spell is over, or before someone can figure out who she is. And basically, he knows that the person who is going to fit into the gold, silver, and silk slipper is the person that he fell in love with at the ball, which is kind of crazy because multiple people can have the same size shoe size, but that's how the prince did it in this fairy tale. She, on the last night of the ball, drops the slipper. He finds it, and he and his staff go around and try to find her. She remains at home and working really hard for her stepmother and stepsisters, and just continues to be treated poorly. And then finally, when the prince comes to their little hostel, the stepsisters are the ones that try on the shoes, because obviously the stepmother doesn't want Cinderella to even be involved. She thinks there's no way that it's her anyway. She wasn't allowed to go to the ball. And the stepsisters, in order to try to convince the prince that they're the person that he fell in love with, they actually cut their toes off. Good grief. They cut their toes off so that their feet can fit inside of the slipper. Their feet were too big. Now, what do you think the prince thought when he saw blood coming out of the shoes? Probably thought, something's up here. Probably not you. And then Cinderella does make herself apparent. She appears and tries on the slipper, realizes that that's, the girl. They get married happily ever after. And then some bad things happen to the stepmother and the stepsisters, but I won't get into that. That's as far as I'll go with the gory details of the original Cinderella, is the stepsisters cutting their toes off. So, if you skip past that, this is the point where you can jump to. We are going to look at different versions of Cinderella from around the world. So remember, fairy tales and folk tales started by word of mouth. So just like if you were to play the game telephone, the sentence that you start out with is probably going to end up being a bit different but similar by the time it reaches, the last person in the telephone line. If we were in class, I probably would have started this lesson with a game of telephone and probably would have whispered something into somebody's ear, and then they would have had to go around, and it would have gone through 24 different ears, and then the last person would try to tell me what I originally said. No, it's going to be a little bit different, but I'm sure that hopefully it'd be a little at least similar. So we're going to listen to The Golden Slipper, which is a Vietnamese legend. And then we're going to also listen to Yeh-Shen, which is a Cinderella story from China. And they are both different takes on Cinderella. So since we're looking at two different stories today, and you're familiar now with the story of Cinderella if you weren't already, when we look at two things, it's important to compare and contrast. Now remember, comparing is when you are telling how they're similar or like, and then contrasting is when you're telling how they're different. Okay? So we're going to fill out a Venn diagram, which I have put on Google Classroom for you. And on your copy, it should have already the titles of the stories above. Okay? So I'm going to read The Golden Slipper first. Something that we already know is different is that this story originated in Vietnam. And then Yeh-Shen originated in China. Okay? And I think that's already on your paper. I helped you and did that already. So without further ado, The Golden Slipper. Look at how beautiful this illustration is. Among the foothills along the Red River in Vietnam, a poor rice farmer lived with his beloved daughter, Tam. The farmer's wife had died, and when he remarried, his new wife treated Tam cruelly. She would often beat the girl or send her to bed without any dinner. Are we already noticing some similarities? After the birth of her own baby girl, the new wife's neglect of Tam became worse. The new daughter, Cam, was cherished as much as Tam was despised. That's a big word that means hated. In time, the farmer grew weak at the thought of his dear daughter's mistreatment, until at last he died of a broken heart. Tam missed her father's kind laughter. Now in the care of her wicked stepmother, Tam worked in the rice fields all day and did all the household chores at night, sleeping for just a few hours in a dirty corner of the kitchen. Often she would dream herself away from her surroundings and imagine herself to be a beautiful princess, married to the prince and living in the royal household. But Tam had little hope of marrying a prince, or marrying anyone for that matter. What little money the family had was saved for Cam's dowry. Having some computer problems here. Beautiful illustrations. Once Tam complained, "Stepmother, why must I work in the fields all day and do all the housework too?" "Spoiled girl," her stepmother replied. "Now that your father is gone, who else will work in the fields? Your sister is too young and too frail to work." That means weak. And with that, stepmother and Cam laughed and whispered to each other. One afternoon, Cam announced, "Mother, Tam and I will catch prawns from the pond for our dinner. Will you cook them for us?" Stepmother agreed, and the girls went to catch the freshwater shrimp, so prawn or shrimp. Tam quickly filled her basket with prawns. She knew to stand quietly in the water and watch for the slight movements of the prawns among the rocks. Then she swept her net swiftly through the water to catch them. So Tam is really good at this. I wonder how Cam is doing. Cam, on the other hand, spent the afternoon playing in the trees. She was afraid to step into the water for fear of getting her long skirt wet. By late afternoon, she realized that she had no prawns to bring home. Spotting a lotus flower across the pond, she begged Tam, "Older sister, before we go, please pick that pretty flower for me. You will bring home the prawns, but at least I will bring home a flower." Do you trust her? Tam waded across the pond to pick the flower, but when she returned, her basket was empty and Cam was gone. Tam sat next to her basket and cried. She missed her father more than ever and wished that her real mother were alive to hold her and comfort her. Tam's tears made the surface of the pond shimmer. She heard her name being called in a soft voice. Tam looked up and saw a beautiful woman dressed in the royal colors, golden yellow and deep orange, standing before her. "A princess should not be crying," said the woman. "I am not a princess. Look at me," Tam cried, pointing at her ragged clothes and her empty basket. "You are a princess," the woman replied. "You are strong and kind, and you have a gentle heart. Listen to the animals that surround you. Listen with your heart, and everything around you will take care of you." With that, the woman vanished, but in Tam's basket, a small catfish swam, its scales of golden yellow and deep orange shimmering in the afternoon sunlight. Tam hurried home and set the fish free in a nearby pond. Each night after dinner, Tam slipped out of the pond to feed her fish with food that she had saved from her bowl. For indeed, Tam had a gentle heart, and all the creatures of the earth were her friends. Each morning, Tam was awakened by the crowing rooster. When she went out to feed it, she said, "Here you are, my morning friend. You need some breakfast since you start your day so early." Then she tossed the rice from her own bowl to the rooster. Tam noticed the golden yellow and deep orange feathers on the bird. "You must be a royal rooster," she teased. "You have the colors of the emperor's robes." The rooster hungrily scratched and pecked each grain of rice. Then it scratched again as if asking for more. "I have no more rice, my friend," Tam scolded gently. The old horse also seemed hungry as it pulled its cart slowly out to the fields each day. Tam allowed the horse to stop frequently to chew on the grass along the way. She said, "I know you are tired, old horse. Once the harvest is done, you know you will have to rest in a bucket of grain." Chew the grass along the way. She said, "I know you are tired, old horse. Once the harvest is done, you will have a rest and a bucket of grain. I promise." The horse's coat, covered with dew, shone golden, yellow, and orange as it slowly pulled each cartful of rice plants from the fields. Tam looked up into the sunlight and remembered that it would soon be the time for the autumn festival, when farmers celebrated their harvest and the prince paid a visit to the village. The farmers made offerings to the gods to thank them for their harvest, and for a few days the work in the fields was forgotten and the villagers celebrated. While Tam worked in the fields, Cam could only think about the new clothes that stepmother had promised her for the festival. "I will have a silk blouse this year and long flowing pants," she chattered. "The prince will surely see me in the crowd and choose me to be his princess. Then I will wear only royal colors, golden, orange, and yellow." Tam, too, had dreams of brand new clothes and marrying the prince. She wished that the words of the mysterious woman were true, but all she could hear was Cam's taunt. "What are you going to wear to the festival, Tam?" On the day of the autumn festival, stepmother pointed to the cart full of rice and plants and said to Tam, "You may go to the festival when you have finished husking all the rice in this cart. I promised the tailor a bag of rice if he would sew Cam's outfit." Cam watched as Cam prepared for the festival in the outfit she had hoped for, a silk blouse and long flowing trousers. "Doesn't she look beautiful, Tam?" stepmother asked, as they left for the festival. Tam turned away. Through her tears, the sunlight shimmered off the mountain of rice plants. It would take many days to complete the task that stepmother had set before her. Many days. Just then, Tam looked up to see the mysterious woman. "Husking is much more fun when you have friends to help," the woman said. Suddenly, a flock of rice birds swooped down on the cart to husk the rice. They shook each plant until all the grains fell into a pile at Tam's feet. Then the birds fluttered their wings in the mountain of rice, and a cloud of hulls flew up. Tam closed her eyes against the dust and the wind. When she opened them, the hulls were gone, and in their place was a light yellow silk blouse. Tam slipped on the blouse and ran to the pond to look at her reflection. As Tam's catfish came out to admire her, its tail splashed a light rain of water over her tattered trousers. Tam looked down and saw that her rags had turned into a pair of flowing black trousers. Tam's friend the rooster was now crowing loudly. Princess Tam, it seemed to say. The rooster bowed and scratched at the dirt at her feet. Tam laughed and bowed. "Emperor Rooster, how do you think I look?" The rooster continued to scratch at the hard dirt until the edge of a beautiful pair of golden brocade slippers peeked through the ground. Tam slipped them on. They completed an outfit that only royalty would wear. When Tam returned to the house, Old Horse stood snorting and impatiently pawing at the ground. Its coat was glistening and smooth, and the horse had a new leather bridle and jeweled saddle. Tam exclaimed, "Old Horse, you are beautiful!" The mysterious woman held the reins and helped Tam onto the saddle. "You truly are a princess," she said. "Oh, how beautiful." Old Horse trotted slowly at first, then broke into a gallop as it neared the royal household. Tam could only hold on. As they rushed toward the festival grounds, one of Tam's slippers fell from her foot. "Wait!" she cried, but the horse would not stop. So her slipper fell off before the festival. Later, as the prince and his court left for the festival, a soldier spotted Tam's fallen slipper. He gave it to the prince, who had never seen such a beautiful work of art. Word spread quickly through the crowd that the prince wished to meet the owner of the brocade slipper. First, the ladies of the court had to try on the slipper. Next, all the noble women tried. At last, any woman at the festival was invited to try her foot in the slipper. And although it appeared that the slipper would fit many women, no one could slip it on. Stepmother pushed Cam to the front of the line, convinced that Cam's foot would fit. She was already dreaming of her life at court as the mother of the princess. As Cam struggled, Stepmother shouted, "Try it again! You're not trying hard enough!" Amidst the commotion, Tam's horse gently nosed its way forward. People backed away when they saw the beautiful young maiden dressed in royal colors. As Tam held out her foot to the prince, Stepmother watched in disbelief. The beautiful brocade slipper fit Tam's foot perfectly. The prince promptly fell in love with Tam and promised to make her his bride. As Tam and the prince rode away, Stepmother shouted, "She is my daughter! She is my daughter!" But the people just pointed at Stepmother and laughed. "Foolish woman," they said. Even after Tam and the prince were married, Stepmother could not forget the laughter that day at the autumn festival. She spent many days after that scolding Cam. "Why didn't your foot fit in the slipper?" she would shout. Occasionally, in the quiet of the evening, Stepmother would hear a strange sound around the house. It might have been splashing of a catfish, the crowing of a rooster, or the whinny of a horse, or it might have been the sound of laughter coming from the prince and his new bride. So that was the story of the golden slipper. And what's cool is at the end of this story, it kind of tells you a little bit about the origins. So what I'm going to do is, instead of taking more time on this video to read this to you, I'm going to photocopy this and I'm going to upload it on Google Classroom where it says reading lesson for the week. I'm going to upload it there so that you can read it at your own, if you choose to. So the golden slipper, there was lots of similarities to Cinderella. There were also a lot of differences. Similarities include, stepmother. However, there was only one stepsister instead of, well, she was actually her half-sister because it was her father's daughter as well. So instead of two stepsisters, it was actually one half-sister. The birds helped her pick up the rice, whereas it was lentils in Cinderella. She had a beautiful slipper that fell. However, it fell off before the festival instead of at the end of the festival. So the prince hadn't even seen her or talked with her before he decided that he wanted to meet the person who belonged to the slipper. Instead of it being a fairy godmother or the white turtle dove that was in the original Cinderella, it was instead a beautiful woman dressed in royal colors. And if you noticed, the catfish was also royal colors, the rooster, and then the horse were those royal orange and yellow colors. The interesting part for me that was a lot different than in the Cinderella story was that Tam and Cam actually went out together and tried to catch some food. And Cam wasn't very nice. Cam stole what Tam was working so hard on all day and brought it back as though she caught it. But she was just playing all day. So that was interesting to see. And of course the slipper didn't fit her half-sister or anybody else for that matter. It fit only Tam. And the prince and her get married. So those are some similarities with Cinderella. However, we're going to compare the golden slipper with Yeh-Shen. So let's get started with this story. Let me see if there's any information in the back of this one. There is not information in the back of this one, so I will only photocopy the golden slipper extra information into the Google Classroom. Now this is kind of long, and my throat is kind of dry, so I am going to sip on my coffee throughout the story. In the dim past, even before the Qin and the Han dynasties, there lived a cave chief in the southern China, by the name of Wu. As was the custom in those days, Chief Wu had taken 2 wives. Each wife had, in her turn, had presented Wu with a baby daughter. But one of the wives sickened and died, and not too many days after that, Chief Wu took to his bed and died too. Yeh-Shen, the little orphan, grew to girlhood in her stepmother's home. She was a bright child and lovely too, with skin as smooth as ivory and dark pools for eyes. Her stepmother was jealous of all of this beauty and goodness, for her own daughter was not pretty at all. So in her displeasure, she gave poor Yeh-Shen the heaviest and most unpleasant chores. The only friend that Yeh-Shen had to her name was a fish that she had named, caught, and raised. It was a beautiful fish with golden eyes, and every day it would come out of the water and rest its head on the bank of the pond, waiting for Yeh-Shen to feed it. Stepmother gave Yeh-Shen little enough food for herself, but the orphan child always found something to share with her fish, which grew to an enormous size. So here's stepmother, and there's Yeh-Shen. Somehow the stepmother heard of this. She was terribly angry to discover that Yeh-Shen had kept a secret from her. She hurried down to the pond, but she was unable to see the fish, for Yeh-Shen's pet wisely hid itself. The stepmother, however, was a crafty woman, and she soon thought of a plan. She walked home and called out, "Yeh-Shen, go and collect some firewood. But wait, the neighbors might see you. Leave your filthy coat here." The minute the girl was out of sight, her stepmother slipped on the coat herself and went down again to the pond. This time the big fish saw Yeh-Shen's familiar jacket and heaved itself onto the bank, expecting to be fed. But the stepmother, having hidden a dagger, that's a small knife, in her sleeve, stabbed the fish, wrapped it in her garments, that's her clothes, and took it home to cook for dinner. How cruel. When Yeh-Shen came to the pond that evening, she found her pet had disappeared. Overcome with grief, the girl collapsed on the ground and dropped her tears into the still waters of the pond. How horrible. "Ah, poor child," a voice said. Yeh-Shen sat up to find a very old man looking down at her. He wore the coarsest of clothes, and his hair flowed down over his shoulders. "Kind uncle, who may you be?" Yeh-Shen asked. "This is not important, my child. All you must know is that I have been sent to tell you of the wondrous powers of your fish." "My fish? But sir," the girl's eyes filled with tears, and she could not go on. The old man sighed and said, "Yes, my child, your fish is no longer alive, and I must tell you that your stepmother is once more the cause of your sorrow." Yeh-Shen gasped in horror. But the old man went on. "Let us not dwell on things that are in the past," he said, "for I have come bringing you a gift. Now you must listen carefully to this. The bones of your fish are filled with a powerful spirit. Whenever you are in serious need, you must kneel before them and let them know your heart's desire, but do not waste their gifts." Yeh-Shen wanted to ask the old sage many more questions, but he rose to the sky before she could utter another word. With a heavy heart, Yeh-Shen made her way to the dung heap to gather the remains of her friend. Time went by, and Yeh-Shen, who was often left alone, took comfort in speaking to the bones of her fish. When she was hungry, which happened quite often, Yeh-Shen asked the bones for food. In this way, Yeh-Shen managed to live from day to day, but she lived in dread that her stepmother would discover her secret and take that even away from her. So the time passed and spring came. Festival time was approaching. It was the busiest time of year. Such cooking and cleaning and sewing there was to be done. Yeh-Shen had hardly a moment's rest. At the spring festival, young men and young women from the village hoped to meet and choose whom they would marry. How Yeh-Shen longed to go, but her stepmother had other plans. She hoped to find a husband for her own daughter and did not want any man to see the beauteous Yeh-Shen first. Lots of jealousy happening here. When finally the holiday arrived, the stepmother and her daughter dressed themselves in their finest clothes and filled their baskets with sweetmeats. "You must remain at home now and watch to see that no one steals fruit from our trees," her stepmother told Yeh-Shen, and then departed for the banquet with her own daughter. As soon as she was alone, Yeh-Shen went to speak to the bones of her fish. "Oh, dear friend," she said, kneeling before the precious bones, "I long to go to the festival, but I cannot show myself in these rags. Is there somewhere I could borrow clothes to fit to wear to the feast?" At once she found herself dressed in a gown of azure blue. That's a type of gemstone. With a cloak of kingfisher feathers draped over her shoulders. Best of all, her tiny feet had the most beautiful slippers she had ever seen on. They were woven of golden threads in a pattern like the scales of fish, and the glistening soles were made of solid gold. There was magic in the shoes, for they should have been quite heavy, yet when Yeh-Shen walked, her feet felt as light as air. "Be sure you do not lose your golden shoes," said the spirit of bones. Yeh-Shen promised to be careful. Delighted with her transformation, she bid a fond farewell to the bones of her fish and slipped off to join in the merrymaking. That day, Yeh-Shen turned many ahead as she appeared to the feast. All around her, people whispered, "Look at that beautiful girl. Who can she be?" Here she comes. But above this, stepsister was heard to say, "Mother, does she not resemble our Yeh-Shen?" Upon hearing this, Yeh-Shen jumped up and ran off before her stepsister could look closely at her. She raced down the mountainside, and in doing so, she lost one of her golden slippers. No sooner had the shoe fallen off of her foot than her fine clothes turned back into rags. Ooh, that's why she wasn't supposed to lose them. Only one thing remained, a tiny golden shoe. Yeh-Shen hurried to the bones of her fish and returned the slipper, promising to find its mate. But now the bones were silent. Sadly, Yeh-Shen realized that she had lost her only friend. She hid the little shoe in her bed straw and went outside to cry. Leaning against a fruit tree, she sobbed and sobbed and sobbed until she fell asleep. The stepmother left the gathering to check on Yeh-Shen, but when she returned home, she found the girl sound asleep with her arms wrapped around a fruit tree. So thinking no more of her, the stepmother rejoined the party. Meantime, a villager had found the shoe, recognizing its worth. He sold it to a merchant, who presented it in turn to the king of the island, kingdom of Tohan. The king was more than happy to accept the slipper as a gift. He was entranced by the tiny thing, which was shaped of the most precious of metals, yet which made no sound when he touched the stone. The more he marveled at its beauty, the more determined he became to find the woman to whom the shoe belonged. A search was begun among the ladies of his own kingdom, but all who tried on the sandal found it impossibly small. Undaunted, the king ordered the search widened to include the cave women from the countryside where the slipper had been found. Since he realized it would take many years for every woman to come to his island and test her foot in the slipper, the king thought of a way to get the right woman to come forward. He ordered the sandal placed in a pavilion by the right side of the road, near where it had been found, and his herald announced that the shoe was to be returned to its original owner. Then, from a nearby hiding place, the king and his men settled down to watch and wait for a woman with tiny feet to come and claim her slipper. All that day, the pavilion was crowded with cave women who had come to test a foot in the shoe. Yeh-Shen's stepmother and stepsister were among them, but not Yeh-Shen. They had told her to stay home. By day's end, although many women had eagerly tried to put the slipper on, it still had not been worn. Wearily, the king continued his vigil into the night. It wasn't the blackest part of the night, while the moon had hid behind a cloud, that Yeh-Shen dared to show her face at the pavilion, and even then she tiptoed timidly across the wide floor. Sinking down to her knees, the girl in rags examined the tiny shoe. Only when she was sure that this was the missing mate to her golden slipper did she dare to pick it up. At last she could return both little shoes to the fish bones. Surely then her beloved spirit would speak to her again. Now the king's first thought, on seeing Yeh-Shen take the precious slipper, was to throw the girl into prison as a thief. But when she turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of her face. At once the king was struck by the sweet harmony of her features, which seemed so out of keeping with the rags that she wore. It was then that he took a closer look and noticed that she walked upon the tiniest feet he had ever seen. With a wave of his hand, the king signaled that this tattered creature was to be allowed to depart with the golden slipper. Quietly, the king's men slipped off and followed her home. All this time, Yeh-Shen was unaware of the excitement she had caused. She had made her way home and was about to hide both sandals in her bedding when there was a pounding at the door. Yeh-Shen went to see who it was and found a king at her doorstep. She was very frightened at first, but the king spoke to her in a kind voice and asked her to try the golden slippers on her feet. The maiden did as she was told, and she stood in her golden shoes, and her rags were transformed once more into the feathered cloak and beautiful azure gown. Her loveliness made her seem a heavenly being, and the king suddenly knew in his heart that he had found his true love. Wow, beautiful. Not long after this, Yeh-Shen was married to the king, but fate was not so gentle with her stepmother and stepsister. Since they had been unkind to his beloved, the king would not permit Yeh-Shen to bring them to his palace. They remained in their cave home, where one day it is said that they were crushed to death by a shower of flying stones. That's intense. The end. Today's lesson was kind of long. Apologize about that, but this is about how long it would be in class. So Yeh-Shen and the golden slipper. Similarities, differences. Let's take a look. The golden slipper took place in Vietnam. Do you remember who the princess's name, what her name was? It was Tam. And in Yeh-Shen, it was Yeh-Shen. Now, there were a couple of times in Yeh-Shen where they called the shoe that she was wearing a slipper, and sometimes they called it a sandal. But when you looked at the picture, it was obvious that it was a slipper, like what you would call a slipper. So something that's similar between these two stories is actually not only the fact that they were wearing magic slippers, but the fact that they were gold, right? Both wore magic, golden slippers. Who was it that fell in love with Tam? He was a prince. Marries a prince. interestingly enough, in Yeh-Shen, she actually marries a king. Marries a king. What's interesting is in both stories, they had fish in them. In the Golden Slipper, the fish was something that she took care of in her own pond. She would feed it food that she stayed from her own bowl. Okay, remember? So that's something that's kind of similar. Remember, it slipped out of the lake that she was at earlier and went home with her. So they both did have a fish in a lake. Both had like a pet fish. But what's different about them is that in Yeh-Shen, the fish is killed by stepmother. And then magic bones are what grants her beautiful outfit for her time at the festival. So we can say her pet fish dies or is killed by stepmother, and then fish's bones grant Yeh-Shen her magic of her outfit. In the Golden Slipper, do you remember who kind of grants her the outfits that she wears? Birds help make it. So in the Golden Slipper, birds made the garments. Something that's similar in both of them that's different from Cinderella that we know is that they both had a half-sister, didn't they? Only one. Both had a stepmom and half-sister. Remember, I say half-sister because it was her actual dad's child as well. What I found interesting in Yeh-Shen is that the original spirit that kind of talks to her is a man. So that's different from any other version I've read before. So the fairy godmother type creature is actually, I'm going to put in quotes, fairy godmother was a male man. I'm going to say spirit because remember he ascended in the sky after he was done talking to her. And then in the Golden Slipper, there was a beautiful woman at the lake, if you remember. So she didn't really necessarily obviously grant her any magic, but as soon as she disappeared, that royal-looking fish flopped out into Tam's care. So fairy godmother character was a beautiful woman. Something that was different in the Golden Slipper is that, if you remember, she wore slacks. So part of the fancy outfit that they were all wearing included pants. They obviously both got married. There were animals involved in both. In Yeh-Shen, the half-sister I don't remember any inkling of her being cruel to Yeh-Shen. There was no examples of that, but then in the Golden Slipper it talked about how her half-sister Cam was just outright cruel to her. So that's something else that I noticed. If you can come up with some more things for your Venn diagram, I'd love to see it. And again, I know this was a long lesson today, and I appreciate you sticking it through, or if you did it in time increments, I appreciate that. I hope that you enjoyed 2 new versions to you from around the world of Cinderella. Have a great day.